Captain Jake Morrison stood in the huge construction bay watching workers put the last metal plates on his ship. The USS Nightingale looked different from every other warship humans had ever built. Other captains had ships with big guns and powerful weapons, but Morrison wanted something else. He wanted a ship that could use stories to fight. The ship's metal skin had special computers built into it. These computers held thousands of human stories, fairy tales, myths, and legends. The ship's main computer was called Mother Goose, and it could make these stories become real using advanced technology. The idea came from Dr. Lisa Bennett, who studied how humans think about stories. Admiral Peter Collins had said yes to building the ship, but he was not happy about it. He called it the most expensive bedtime story the military had ever paid for. The aliens who worked with humans laughed at the idea. They thought humans were being silly again with their made-up stories. The Zephyrian ambassador named Kethvar said humans should send poets to fight instead of real soldiers. Morrison's crew had 800 people on it. Some were normal military people, but others were experts in stories, myths, and fairy tales. Commander Amy Rodriguez was his second in command, and she had wanted to transfer to another ship when she first heard about the Nightingale, she thought. The whole idea was crazy, but now, after 3 months of testing, she was starting to respect her. Captain the bridge of the ship looked like something from a fairy tale book. The screen showed not just normal military information, but flowing stories and moving pictures of all the tales stored in the ship's memory. Chief Engineer Tony Martinez had designed the engine room around something he called narrative drive. The ship's power came partly from how much people believed in the stories. It was beautiful and amazing, but no one knew if it would work in a real fight. Morrison walked through the ship, watching his crew prepare for their first real mission. The weapons officer, Lieutenant Katie Phillips, was running practice drills with guns that fired concentrated story energy instead of normal bullets. The security chief, Danny Clark, was teaching his team special procedures with names, like Sleeping Beauty Protocol and breadcrumb navigation systems. Even the most loyal crew members sometimes wondered if they were on a real warship or just playing pretend. Dar Bennett worked in a special room filled with computers that processed stories. She and her team had loaded everything they could find into the ship's memory banks. Old fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm, ancient myths from every culture on Earth, modern science fiction stories, and even urban legends people told on the internet. The ship's computers hummed with the collected imagination of the entire human race. The other ships in the human fleet looked normal. They had thick armor, powerful shields, and weapons that could destroy planets. When other captains visited the Nightingale, they shook their heads and whispered to each other. Some thought Morrison was brave for trying something new, but most thought he was foolish. Admiral Sarah Williams, who commanded the main human fleet, was polite but clearly had doubts about bringing an untested ship into battle. The alien allies were even less kind. General Thrix from the Centaurian fleet said fairy tales would not stop reality bombs. The Andromedan delegation, led by Ambassador Zara 9, tried to be diplomatic, but they also thought the whole project was a waste of time and resources. They had been fighting the Void Syndicate for years, and nothing had worked against their strange weapons. Morrison knew what everyone thought about his ship, but he believed in the project. Humans were different from other species because they told stories and believed in impossible things. Every human child grew up hearing tales about heroes who won against terrible odds, about good beating evil, about magic being real if you just believed hard enough. Other species had myths too, but humans lived their stories in a way that was unique in the galaxy. The call came through the ship's communication system while Morrison was inspecting the Narrative Warfare Center. The Void Syndicate had attacked the colony world of New Haven. 12 different alien species had already lost their homeworlds to the Syndicate's reality-warping weapons. All available ships were ordered to meet at the Kepler defense line for humanity's first major battle in the Galactic War. Morrison gathered his senior officers in the main briefing room. The walls showed tactical displays mixed with flowing text from famous battle stories throughout human history. Commander Rodriguez looked worried but determined. Dr. Bennett was excited because this would be the first real test of her theories. Chief Martinez was confident in his engines, but nervous about the untested narrative drive systems. The captain looked at each of his officers and spoke clearly. They were about to find out if human stories were just entertainment or if they could actually change reality. The ship's computers were loaded with every tale of courage and hope humanity had ever created. The crew had trained for months to operate systems that ran on belief as much as electricity. As the USS Nightingale prepared to leave the construction yard, Morrison felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. 800 lives depended on his leadership and his faith in an impossible idea. The entire human race would be watching to see if their most unconventional weapon could succeed where traditional forces had failed. The ship's engines started with a sound like distant singing as the narrative drive came online. For the first time since construction began, the Nightingale felt truly alive, as if every story humanity had ever told was waking up at the same time. The bridge crew watched their displays fill with swirling galaxies of tales and legends, dancing together in patterns of light and possibility. The Kepler defense line was busy with over 200 warships from many different species getting ready for battle. The USS Nightingale arrived and took its position among the other vessels, but it drew strange looks and quiet laughter from the crews of more normal ships. Admiral Sarah Williams commanded the human fleet from the USS Constitution, and she could barely hide how much she doubted. Morrison's unusual ship, Commander Luke Harrison of the USS Titan, spoke openly during the tactical briefing about his concerns. He looked directly at Morrison and said that bringing what was basically a floating library to a shooting war seemed like a bad idea. The Void Syndicate ships could phase in and out of reality itself, and they destroyed conventional weapons easily. Harrison wanted to know how fairy tales were supposed to fight enemies like that. Morrison stayed calm as he explained what the Nightingale could do, but even he felt uncertain about what was coming. His weapons officer, Lieutenant Katie Phillips, had run countless computer simulations, but they were about to enter completely unknown territory. The ship systems were based on theories about humanity's greatest strength, which was their ability to believe in stories and make them real through pure faith and determination. The alien commanders were much less polite than the humans. General Thrix of the Centaurian fleet dismissed all humans by saying that fairy tales would never stop reality bombs. Even humanity's closest allies had serious doubts about the project. The Andromedan delegation led by Ambassador Zara 9 tried to be diplomatic, but they clearly thought bringing an untested vessel into such an important battle was foolish and dangerous. Dr. Bennett worked frantically with her team to calibrate the storytelling matrices that were built into every part of the ship. They had loaded everything from ancient grim fairy tales to modern urban legends that people shared on the internet. The ship's computer cores hummed with the collected imagination of humanity waiting for the right moment to spring into action and prove that stories could be more powerful than any weapon. Chief Petty Officer Danny Clark drilled his security teams on procedures that sounded like they came from fantasy novels instead of military manuals. They practiced awakening the Sleeping Beauty protocol for emergency power restoration and breadcrumb navigation systems for rescue operations in hostile territory. Even the most dedicated crew members occasionally wondered if they were serving on a real warship or participating in some kind of elaborate game. The bridge crew ran system checks on equipment that operated according to narrative logic rather than normal physics. Lieutenant Phillips tested fairy tale cannons that fired concentrated story energy. The engineering teams calibrated the narrative drive that drew power from how much people believed in the tales stored in the ship's memory banks. Every system on the Nightingale was designed to work better when the crew had faith in impossible things. Enemy forces began appearing on long-range sensors, and the readings were terrifying. The Void Syndicate fleet numbered in the thousands, with ships that crackled with energies that seemed to bend space and time around them. Conventional tactics had failed against these enemies repeatedly across the galaxy. Now humanity's most unconventional weapon was about to face the ultimate test of whether stories could defeat nightmares made real. Admiral Williams called a final briefing for all ship captains, and Morrison attended via video link from the Nightingale's bridge. The other commanders looked grim as they reviewed intelligence reports about Syndicate capabilities. Their ships could edit themselves out of existence to avoid damage, then reappear instantly to attack. They fired weapons that made their targets forget they had ever been built, leaving crews floating helplessly in space. Morrison listened to the tactical discussions, but his mind was focused on the stories loaded in his ship's computers. Every human culture had tales about heroes facing impossible odds and winning through courage rather than strength. The Nightingale was built around the idea that these stories contained a kind of truth that could reshape reality. If enough people believed in them with sufficient intensity and conviction, Dr. Bennett reported that all narrative systems were ready for deployment. The ship's AI, called Mother Goose, had processed millions of stories and identified the most powerful themes and patterns. Tales of small heroes defeating giant monsters, stories about love conquering hate, legends about good triumphing over evil despite overwhelming odds. All of these narratives were loaded and ready to manifest as needed during the coming battle. Commander Rodriguez walked through the ship, checking on crew readiness, and found an interesting mix of confidence and nervousness. The traditional military personnel were worried about fighting with untested equipment, while the narrative specialists were excited to finally put their theories into practice. Everyone understood they were about to attempt something that had never been tried before in the history of galactic warfare. The alien fleet commanders continued to express doubts right up until the moment enemy ships began emerging from hyperspace. Captain X9 of the Andromedan heavy cruiser sent a private message to Morrison, wishing him luck but suggesting he stay back from the main battle lines until his systems were proven in combat. Even humanity's allies expected the Nightingale to be destroyed quickly by enemies who could manipulate reality itself. Morrison gathered his senior staff for a final briefing in the main conference room. The walls displayed flowing text from heroic stories throughout human history mixed with tactical data about the approaching enemy fleet. He looked at each officer and reminded them that they were not just fighting for humanity but for the power of imagination itself. Every story ever told by their species had led to this moment. The captain activated the ship's primary systems, and throughout, the Nightingale screens flickered to life, showing swirling galaxies of stories. Myths danced with legends, while fairy tales spun into tactical displays that made no sense according to normal military doctrine. For the first time since construction began, the ship felt truly alive, as if every story humanity had ever created was awakening simultaneously in preparation for battle. As enemy forces continued to pour out of hyperspace, Morrison gave the order that would begin humanity's most unconventional military engagement. The USS Nightingale moved into position with systems that operated on faith and imagination rather than conventional physics. 800 crew members prepared to fight nightmares with bedtime stories and somehow make it work through sheer determination and belief in happy endings. The Void Syndicate fleet emerged from hyperspace looking like nightmares that had learned to fly through space. Their ships defied everything normal about geometry and physics by twisting through dimensions that hurt to look at directly. Reality seemed to bend and warp around them, turning nearby stars into question marks and making asteroids forget they had ever existed in the first place. Admiral Williams opened the communication channel to all ships in the defense fleet, and her voice was steady despite the fear everyone could feel. She told all vessels to engage the enemy at will and wished them luck in whatever gods they believed in. The first wave of conventional attacks began immediately and proved to be just as useless as intelligence reports had predicted they would be. Plasma beams from human cruisers passed through Syndicate vessels as if they were made of mist or dreams. Kinetic projectiles fired from alien ships struck enemy hulls and simply ceased to exist without leaving any trace behind. The return fire from the Void Syndicate was even worse than anyone had expected, because their reality bombs made entire sections of attacking ships forget they had ever been built, leaving crews floating helplessly in the vacuum of space. Captain Morrison watched in horror as 3 Allied cruisers vanished in impossible ways that violated every law of physics he knew. One ship turned into a flock of origami birds that scattered into space and disappeared among the stars. Another began aging backwards until it became a blueprint, then a dream, then nothing at all. The third simply edited itself out of existence, leaving behind only a confused radio transmission asking what they had been talking about. Commander Rodriguez called out from her station that the USS Constitution was requesting immediate assistance because they had lost main power and their reality anchors were failing. Morrison could see Admiral Williams' flagship beginning to flicker in and out of existence as Syndicate weapons tried to convince it that it had never been real. The situation was desperate and conventional military tactics were proving completely useless against enemies who could rewrite the laws of reality. Morrison nodded to Dr. Bennett and gave the order that would change everything. He told her to initiate the little engine that could protocol, and his bridge crew exchanged nervous glances because they had practiced this procedure, but theory and actual combat were vastly different things. Dr. Bennett's fingers moved quickly over her narrative interface as the ship's I began weaving one of humanity's most persistent stories into the fabric of space and time itself. Suddenly the USS Nightingale began to glow with warm golden light that seemed to come from within its hull rather than from any external source. The ship's metal skin rippled as if it were breathing, and when enemy reality bombs struck the vessel, something extraordinary happened that no one had expected. The ship simply refused to believe the bombs were real, and the attacks bounced off, harmlessly dismissed as just pretend by a consciousness that had internalized every story about determination overcoming impossible odds. Admiral Williams' voice came over the communication channel, filled with amazement and disbelief, as she asked how the Nightingale was still intact when every other ship that had been hit was either destroyed or severely damaged. Morrison replied while watching his ship begin to accelerate toward the enemy fleet with momentum that should have been impossible according to normal physics. He told her it was because they thought they could, and they thought they could, and they thought they could. Lieutenant Phillips, at the weapons station, called out readings that defied everything she knew about military technology. The fairy tale cannons were charging to full power while the Three Little Pigs' defensive matrix was holding steady against continued enemy attacks. The Jack and the Beanstalk systems were climbing to engagement range using principles that made no sense according to conventional science but worked perfectly according to story logic that had been programmed into every system on the ship. The Nightingale opened fire, and the cosmos seemed to hold its breath as streams of pure story energy erupted from the ship's weapon batteries. Golden threads of narrative wrapped around Syndicate vessels, forcing them to exist within human fairy tale logic instead of their own reality warping rules. A massive void dreadnought found itself suddenly vulnerable to huffing and puffing while its advanced armor became useless against weapons that operated according to completely different principles. Dr. Bennett worked frantically at her station, coordinating with narrative warfare teams throughout the ship as they deployed story after story against enemies who had never encountered anything like human imagination weaponized and made manifest through advanced technology. Tales of brave little tailors defeating giants merged with legends of clever underdogs outwitting powerful villains, creating a cascade of narrative energy that began to reshape the battlefield itself. Chief Engineer Tony Martinez reported from the engine room that the narrative drive was operating beyond all theoretical limits as the ship literally became more real than the reality around it. The Nightingale was not just fighting the enemy but rewriting the fundamental rules of engagement by imposing human story logic on a situation that had previously operated according to void Syndicate physics that allowed them to manipulate space and time. But the most shocking moment came when Martinez activated what he called the ship's ultimate protocol, and the entire vessel began to transform. The hull reshaped itself according to ancient patterns found in every story humanity had ever told about impossible victories against overwhelming odds. The ship became a living embodiment of every fairy tale about heroes who refused to give up no matter how hopeless things seemed. Other human ships in the fleet began to notice that something had changed in the fabric of space around the Nightingale. Reality itself seemed more stable and hopeful in the area where the ship operated. The USS Constitution found its systems coming back online as story Energy spread outward from Morrison's vessel like ripples in a pond, affecting everything within range of its narrative field. The Void Syndicate fleet, which had seemed invincible, moments before now found themselves trapped in scenarios where their usual advantages meant nothing. Ships that could phase through normal attacks were now solid and vulnerable because fairy tale logic demanded that monsters be defeatable by brave heroes. Reality bombs that had destroyed dozens of civilizations became harmless fireworks because the stories insisted that good must triumph over evil. Morrison stood on his bridge, watching tactical displays that showed impossible things happening across the entire battlefield. Enemy formations were breaking apart under assault from weaponized hope, while Allied vessels that had been on the verge of destruction were suddenly finding their luck turning around. The captain smiled as he realized that humanity's greatest weapon had always been their refusal to accept that happy endings were impossible even in the darkest circumstances. The USS Nightingale had become something beyond normal understanding as it transformed into a living embodiment of humanity's refusal to accept defeat. The ship's hull now gleamed with inscriptions from every culture's heroic tales and reality. Itself seemed to bend around the vessel to accommodate human stubbornness and the power of stories that insisted impossible things could happen if people believed hard enough. Commander Rodriguez watched her tactical displays in amazement as they showed something that should have been completely impossible according to everything she knew about military science. The ship was not just fighting the enemy fleet, but was actually changing the fundamental rules of engagement by forcing Void Syndicate vessels to operate within narrative logic instead of their usual reality warping systems that had made them seemingly invincible. The enemy fleet, which had seemed unstoppable moments before, now found themselves trapped in scenarios where plucky underdogs had distinct advantages over larger and more powerful opponents. A massive void carrier suddenly discovered it could be defeated by clever tricks and courage, just like every giant in every fairy tale that human children had ever been told. Their reality bombs became harmless when fired at targets protected by true love or pure heart defensive matrices. Dr. Bennett's voice echoed across the bridge as she coordinated with narrative warfare teams throughout the ship while deploying one story protocol after another. She activated the tortoise and hare system, which made enemy speed advantages actually work against them. She implemented David and Goliath protocols that turned the Syndicate's massive size into a vulnerability rather than a strength. Every tale of small heroes defeating large monsters was being weaponized and deployed against foes who had no defense against story logic. Admiral Williams watched from the Constitution as her own ship's systems came back online after being nearly destroyed by reality bombs that had tried to convince the vessel it had never existed. She could barely believe what she was seeing as the impossible happened across the entire battlefield. She opened communication channels to all ships and told them to follow the Nightingale's lead because even though she did not understand what Morrison was doing, it was clearly working. Captain Morrison smiled as he watched enemy formations break apart under assault from weaponized hope and determination. He gave orders that sounded like they came from storybooks rather than military manuals. He told Chief Ganny Clark to initiate 7 samurai defense protocols for the colony ships that were fleeing the battle zone. He instructed Lieutenant Katie Phillips to target the enemy flagship with everything they had while reminding her that in every story the biggest villain always falls last. The battle became something unprecedented in galactic history as Syndicate ships that had conquered dozens of civilizations found themselves outmaneuvered by vessels operating according to fairy tale logic. A human destroyer following the Nightingale's example began broadcasting the little red engine over all frequencies and suddenly found itself able to climb impossible trajectories to rescue stranded civilian craft that had been given up for lost. Chief Engineer Tony Martinez reported from the engine room that the narrative drive was operating at 150% efficiency as the ship literally became more real than the reality around it. The Nightingale was not just winning the battle, but was rewriting the fundamental rules of this engagement by imposing human story patterns on a conflict that had previously operated according to Void Syndicate physics, other ships and the human Fleet began reporting impossible occurrences as the narrative energy spread outward from Morrison's vessel. Damaged cruisers repaired themselves through determination and elbow grease, while outnumbered squadrons found themselves blessed with beginner's luck that allowed them to perform maneuvers that should have been impossible. Rescue operations succeeded. Against all odds, because heroes always arrive just in time according to the stories, the alien crews throughout the defense. Fleet watched in amazement as humanity transformed the nature of warfare itself through sheer force of imagination. The Andromedan fleet commander Zaranine transmitted directly to Morrison, telling him that his species continued to astonish everyone by weaponizing hope itself and turning it into something that could defeat enemies who manipulated reality as easily as breathing. But the Void Syndicate had one final desperate gambit as their fleet began merging into a single massive entity that existed in all dimensions simultaneously. It was every nightmare given form and every fear made manifest into something that could devour entire star systems. The merged creature was concentrated darkness that seemed to suck light and hope out of the universe itself. Against such overwhelming evil, even fairy tales seemed inadequate. Morrison walked to the center of his bridge and placed his hand on the ship's narrative core while his crew watched nervously. The displays around them showed the approaching monster that dwarfed even the largest space stations and seemed to exist partially outside normal reality. He looked at his officers and told the computer to load the final protocol that they had never tested because it was too dangerous to attempt during peacetime exercises. Commander Rodriguez spoke quietly, warning him that the ultimate protocol had never been tested, and they had no idea what would happen if they activated it. The theoretical models suggested it might work, but it could just as easily destroy the ship and everyone aboard. Morrison looked at her with absolute confidence and told her they knew exactly what would happen because humanity had been telling this particular story for thousands of years. The USS Nightingale began to sing not with engines or weapons, but with the voice of every human story ever told about light conquering darkness. The ship became pure narrative energy as it crystallized humanity's fundamental belief that good always triumphs over evil in the end, not because it is stronger or better armed, but because it refuses to give up no matter how hopeless things seem. The merged syndicate entity struck with the force of collapsing universes, seeking to devour the small human vessel that dared to oppose something so vast and terrible. Space itself began to twist and buckle under the assault as the monster tried to edit the Nightingale out of existence using reality bombs that could unmake entire planets. But as the attack reached Morrison's ship, something extraordinary happened. That changed everything. The Nightingale simply smiled at the approaching darkness and began to tell it a different story. Instead of destruction and despair, the ship offered tales of redemption where monsters could be redeemed and even the darkest hearts could find light. The vessel broadcast stories about every ending being really just a new beginning, and how even the most terrible villains could choose to become heroes if they truly wanted to change. The USS Nightingale activated every story protocol simultaneously as the ship's chronometers reached exactly midnight according to ship time. The vessel became a cascading symphony of human narrative, with each tale reinforcing all the others in a tapestry of impossible possibility. The ship did not just believe in victory, but made victory inevitable through the sheer force of every happy ending that humanity had ever imagined or dreamed about. Throughout their entire history, the Void Syndicate's merged entity fired its ultimate weapon, which was a reality storm designed to erase the Nightingale from all possible timelines so that it would never have existed in the first place. But as the weapon struck, something extraordinary happened that defied every law of physics known to galactic science. The ship absorbed the attack and transformed it, because every story knows that the darkest moment always comes just before the dawn breaks. Dr. Bennett called out from her station with wonder filling her voice as she reported that the ship was broadcasting their stories across subspace frequencies that reached every human vessel in the fleet. The narrative energy was making all of them resonate with story logic and changing not just this battle, but how humans would fight forever. They were not just winning one engagement, but transforming the nature of warfare itself through the power of imagination, across the Kepler defense line human crews began reporting occurrences that should have been impossible according to everything they knew about military technology. Damaged ships repaired themselves through determination and old-fashioned hard work. Outnumbered squadrons found themselves blessed with the kind of luck that only happens to heroes in stories. Rescue operations succeeded against overwhelming odds because good people always arrive just in time to save the day. The alien crews throughout the defensive fleet watched in complete amazement as humanity transformed warfare through sheer, stubborn belief in happy endings. The Andromedan Fleet Commander Zara-9 transmitted directly to Captain Morrison, telling him that his species continued to astonish everyone by proving that hope itself could be weaponized and turned into something more powerful than any conventional military technology ever developed. But the merged Void Syndicate entity had become something beyond description as it grew into a reality-eating monster that existed in all dimensions at the same time. It was every nightmare given physical form, and every fear made manifest into something that could devour entire civilizations without effort. The creature represented concentrated darkness that seemed to drain light, hope, and joy from the universe, simply by existing in the same space. Morrison stood at the center of his bridge and placed both hands on the ship's narrative core while looking at displays that showed the approaching monster. It was larger than space stations and seemed to exist partially outside normal reality, which made conventional weapons completely useless against it. He looked around at his crew and spoke with absolute certainty about what they needed to do to save not just themselves but everyone. Commander Rodriguez warned him quietly that the final protocol they were about to attempt had never been tested, because it was too dangerous to try during peacetime exercises. The theoretical models suggested it might work, but it could just as easily destroy their ship and kill everyone aboard. Morrison replied with complete confidence that they knew exactly what would happen because humanity had been telling this particular story for thousands of years across every culture. The USS Nightingale began to sing with a sound that was not made by engines or weapons, but came from the voice of every human story ever told about light conquering darkness. The ship became pure narrative as it crystallized humanity's most fundamental belief that good always triumphs over evil in the end, not because it is stronger, but because it simply refuses to give up no matter how hopeless things become. The merged syndicate entity attacked with the force of collapsing universes as it tried to devour the small human vessel that dared to oppose something so vast and terrible. Reality itself began to buckle and twist under the assault as the monster used weapons that could unmake entire star systems. But as the attack reached the Nightingale, something happened that no one had expected, and that changed the course of galactic history forever. The ship absorbed the darkness and began to tell it a different story altogether. Instead of tales about destruction and despair, the Nightingale offered narratives of redemption where even monsters could find salvation. The vessel broadcast stories about how the darkest hearts could discover light and how every ending was really just the beginning of something better. It told the entity that even the most terrible villains could choose to become heroes. The effect was instantaneous and spread across the entire galaxy as every Void Syndicate ship began to change in ways that seemed impossible. The reality warping. Vessels did not just surrender or retreat, but actually transformed into something completely different. Warships became gardens filled with flowers from 1,000 worlds. Weapon systems turned into musical instruments that played songs of hope and peace. The massive reality-eating monster became a vast library preserving the stories of every civilization it had consumed. Admiral Williams opened the fleet-wide communication channel one final time with tears streaming down her face as she looked at readings that showed the impossible had actually happened. She told all ships to stand down from combat operations because the war was over. Somehow, impossibly and beautifully, the entire conflict had ended not with destruction but with transformation and the promise of peace. Captain Morrison looked around his bridge at crew members who were staring at displays showing rescued civilizations and transformed enemies. The readings indicated that reality itself had become a little more hopeful and a little more willing to believe in happy endings. He smiled and gave the order that would conclude humanity's first and last Galactic War by telling all hands to secure from battle stations and set course for home, the USS. Nightingale turned toward Earth, followed by grateful fleets from dozens of species and preceded by news that would reshape galactic civilization forever. Humanity had won not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through the simple, radical act of believing that every story deserves a happy ending, and that even the darkest tales can be rewritten if enough people have faith. 6 months later, the Galactic Council established the Department of Narrative Defense with Captain Morrison as its first director. Dr. Bennett's research into story-based technology became the foundation for a new age of exploration and diplomacy throughout the galaxy. The USS Nightingale became the flagship of what people called the Fairy Tale Fleet, which was a squadron of vessels each designed around humanity's gift for transforming reality through stories. In every human home and school, children learned a new bedtime story about the warship that everyone thought was just make-believe until the day it saved the galaxy. By refusing to stop believing in happy endings and proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply the determination to never give up hope,